Hello coders, today we're going to be talking about upgrading from different versions of PHP, in particular PHP 5.6 to PHP 7.3. And yes, there are still a lot of applications out there that still run 5.6. As a freelance developer, I've witnessed a whole bunch of legacy applications, and yes, they are still running old code. As a side note, if you are getting into this PHP industry, you are probably going to be starting on legacy applications rather than new applications running new versions of PHP. So how do you go from 5.6 to 7.3? Well, first of all, you need to understand the challenges that you might face. And there is an awful lot of challenges, especially what I've witnessed with clients that don't actually have the ownership and responsibility of the version of PHP that they're using. So, for example, if you're running your application on a shared hosting provider and you don't have access to that, as in on the command line to alter things, then you're going to have to be singing to their hymn sheet. Now, they are supporting other applications, so they need to be considerate about those things. It's not just your application that you're running. Yes, there are dialogue conversations that you have to have with the people who have the responsibility and ownership of these things. Now, you might be running not only a legacy version of PHP, but you might also be running a legacy version of the operating system on your hosting provider. And that might cause an issue. Perhaps PHP 7.3 or just PHP 7 in general isn't in that operating system or isn't provided by that operating system. Maybe that operating system is so old that it's just not aware of that. And maybe the person or team or whatever supporting that operating system just hasn't on the roadmap got anything about upgrading PHP yet. So you need to first of all work out whether or not it is possible, because in some cases it isn't, not yet. Second of all, you need to make sure that your application, the thing that you're upgrading, is PHP 7 ready. And there are so many issues with this, with legacy code, that just hasn't been written for the new style of PHP. And yes, there are some really bad code that I've seen on very old versions of PHP. For example, you might be using various deprecated methods or function calls. You might also have hacked up config in your PHP ini, and you might also be using extensions that just don't exist anymore. And so you need to work out the actual cost of development time to actually upgrade your application. Okay, so let's say, for example, the hosting provider has okayed the upgrade to PHP 7.3, or perhaps they are requiring that from you and therefore you have to upgrade to PHP 7.3. And let's say you've worked out all the things that you need to do in order to upgrade to 7.3 in your application. So how do you actually go about doing that? Because you're going to be running two applications, one in PHP 7.3 and one in PHP 5.6. One thing I highly recommend to solve this issue is to use Docker. Create your hosting platform in a Docker image, in a Docker ecosystem. Try and replicate what you've got on production in the legacy world. Then do the same thing, but in the world that you want to use. So in the PHP 7.3 world. And then you've got the same application running totally different versions of things, and you can work out what needs to be fixed, what needs to be changed, and so on and so forth in the new world. Always have the old world as reference. This can pose issues with other dependencies. So for example, If you're hacking up your MySQL queries, for instance, and then you suddenly realize, well, the operating system that we've just upgraded to allow PHP 7.3 doesn't support the version of MySQL that we're running on PHP 5.6. Therefore, we need to upgrade MySQL to another version. But hey, we need to fix all of these queries because all of these queries are not written for the latest and greatest version of MySQL that is supported in this operating system. So you can kind of see where this dependency headache comes from. You upgrade one thing, but you actually have to upgrade so much more. So the first thing I should say is that if anybody asks you, how long is this going to take? Then there is a huge unknown, and that is the unknown of the other things that you have to upgrade to allow for this version of PHP to be upgraded to 7.3. Believe you me, I've been working on legacy applications where you go and move one stone, but you have to bring up all the other stones as well. And I must say, at this stage, it is extremely tempting to look at your code and try and make it better. And I don't mean refactoring your code. I mean changing it. Changing the structure of your code, changing the foundations of your code. You've got to be careful here. The remit is just upgrading PHP from one version to the next. You now have to upgrade other things to allow that to happen, and then you're in that mindset of upgrading, and you take a look at your application and you're thinking, perhaps I should also alter the code to change the way the foundations of this application work. Be very cautious with this because you will go in a completely different direction, and this is something that I'm just talking about from experience. You really just want to upgrade your version of PHP. So you've now got a Docker environment that mimics the legacy and the new world, and you're using the new world like a test case. And this is the next point that I want to make. You want to test your application. If your application doesn't have any unit tests, any integration tests, any acceptance tests, then your application is not ready to be upgraded to the next version of PHP. I'm sorry, but it's as simple as that. If you can't have something that comes back and says, yes, all of these things work, then you certainly are just coding in the dark. You might as well just turn the light off and just bash the keyboard around, because you're not going to know what works and what doesn't work with the next version or latest version of PHP. And I can't stress enough that this is a humongous step to take. It's a very bold step to take. You are literally pulling the tablecloth off of the table whilst trying to keep all the cutlery and all the plates upright. If you don't have any tests, then it's just going to be a massive mess. So you want to make sure, first of all, that you've got your tests. The important tests here are acceptance tests, because these tests are customer driven or client driven, or whoever is owning the product, because they will say whether or not it is acceptable. So yes, your code might be completely stinking. It might be a complete mess in PHP 5.6. However, if your acceptance tests all pass and it is acceptable from the owner's point of view, not from a code point of view, from an ownership point of view, then you can see that as something to aspire to in the new world in PHP 7.3. Your unit tests, sure, they are, you do need them, of course, but just be careful when you are using your unit tests, because it will go back into the thought process of, I need to break all of these things and fix all of these things and change all of these things, when actually all you're doing is changing your version of PHP. So I can't stress that enough. That is all you're doing. You're changing your version of PHP from one to the other. This isn't an excuse to just change the whole application. And another point that I should make from a freelancer's point of view again is that this shouldn't be an excuse for feature creep. Oh, you're upgrading PHP. Right, perhaps we can actually put in some features No, 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 no. This, like I said, I can't stress enough, is an extremely fragile time for your application. You want to be putting in a code freeze, a feature freeze. You don't want anybody changing your application whilst you're upgrading to PHP. And there are some things that you cannot test very easily, especially in legacy code, especially if you're not going to be changing the code. And so you need to have a bedding in period. You need to have a period that actually allows your application to run in the new infrastructure, in the new world. And so you can check and test your code, your application, your project. And you have a sort of an area, a soft period of time after it's gone live where you can quickly fix anything that comes up. And of course, if anything does come up, and it always does. If anything does come up, then you write tests for those things, and so they don't actually break ever again. But just be clear that this is a change of the infrastructure. The challenge, of course, is that many clients will just see this as just a piece of boring work. None of this is actually going to provide any feasible, measurable, tangible benefits. However, with PHP 7, of course, you can talk about the speed improvements, but just be careful because you have to measure that. You have to have something tangible to promote the fact that you need to be doing this upgrade. But what happens if your client, your customer, the product owner doesn't want to move to the latest and greatest PHP stable version? Well, there are a couple of things you can mention and really stress. The first one is that PHP 5.6 has reached end of life. This means that it's no longer being supported, it's not being upgraded. This means it is vulnerable to security issues. So that's number one. Number two is that any new talent coming in, any new developers coming in to help with the project will be wanting to work on PHP 7 because that is now should be the industry standard right now. This is the stable version of PHP. Nobody wants to work on older versions of things. Not the new people who are coming in who are learning PHP 7 and then finding out that they suddenly need to work on legacy code. Unfortunately, that is kind of what happens. Everybody works on legacy code from time to time, unfortunately, but still it's more of an incentive to say that your application runs the best stable version of PHP. The third point that you can ride home is that PHP 7 is miles faster than PHP 5.6. Be careful though, because you don't want to get into a conversation of metrics and how you measure that kind of thing. But PHP 7 is humongously faster than PHP 5.6. Especially if you start tweaking the op cache, especially if you use optimized autoloaders in Composer, it is extremely, extremely fast. Now, legacy code is all around us. We can't get away from legacy code. And I'm interested to know whether you're still supporting 5.6 and whether or not you have a roadmap in place with a period of time where you can upgrade to PHP 7. Let me know, put your thoughts down in the comments below. And also, if you've already done this, let me know what you've done or the challenges that you faced when doing so. Thank you ever so much for watching or for listening on the podcast. Happy coding, everyone. I'll see you again soon. Cheers. Bye.